This is Kevin Purcell with the second video in our series on sermon prep using Logos Bible software. Now, the first time we talked about finding a subject or a topic if you're a topical preacher, or if you want to search for a text that you want to preach in an expository sermon, but you want to go at it from discovering a text based on a topic instead of you've already picked out a passage. Well, this time we're going to focus more on how you choose your passage and what specific verses to include in the sermon. So here we've got Logos Bible software open, and we're going to try to find our text. And you sort of already have an idea probably by this point in the sermon preparation process, saying, I want to preach on John chapter 13, verses 34 and 35. You've read through that. Maybe it was a devotional reading, or you've been reading through the book of John, or maybe you've been preaching through the book of John, and you decide, hey, I really want to cover those two verses, but you need to decide, is it really best to start at verse 34 and end at verse 35? Maybe there's a little bit more to it than that. And so we're going to take a look at it. Make sure you watch or read rather, the post that I have. It talks a little bit about the idea of expository preaching and why that's a good thing. I'm not going to go into much detail here. I'm primarily an expository preacher, which means that I take a text, the text is sort of the driving thing behind the sermon instead of a topic. Sometimes a topical sermon will include multiple texts. And I decide, I really want to focus on one primary text of Scripture. We're going to get started with using some of the tools in Logos Bible software. And the first thing you want to do is really just kind of open your favorite Bible. I'm going to open up the Christian Standard Bible. Go over here to John chapter 13, 31. Back it up a little bit from that passage. And really what I'm going to do is I'm just going to read through John chapter 13. And so I'll read through this in this translation and go all the way from beginning to end. I might read also the passage before, the chapter before and the chapter after. If it's a smaller book of the Bible, say, you're reading Jude, obviously you'd read the whole book. Or if it's something like Haggai in the Old Testament, you'd probably read the whole book to see where the text that you've initially chosen fits into the overall scheme of the book or the overall message of the book. John, you might do that. It's 21 chapters, so you might sit down and read through the whole thing at once or over a couple of set reading sessions. But really, I think in this case, it's probably okay to just read maybe chapter 12 through 14. And so you'll do that first. And you might also decide, hey, I think I should read it in another translation. So I'm going to go ahead and open the ESV as well. And maybe I won't read all of what I read in my first Bible. Maybe I've kind of narrowed in and said, I'm just kind of focused on the passage before, the one I'm preaching on, and the one after. So I might read, based on the pericope set up in the ESV, I might choose to read through, 21 down through the end of the chapter here. But what I've decided is, hey, I want to preach through verses 31 through 35, definitely. Am I going to go on to verse 36? Now, you see things like these headings for the pericopes. Be careful with those because, just because the translators of the CSB think that that's where the next section starts, doesn't necessarily mean that should be where your sermon ends and then the next one that you might preach later on begins. And so be careful about that. Here's what I do. After reading through it a few times in just a single translation of the Bible, then the next thing I do is I open up what's called the Passage Analysis tool. You go up here to your Tools menu, and then you go over here in the third column under Passage and look for the Passage Analysis tool. We'll open that up. It's going to open a new window. It doesn't open in a tab. You'll notice I've got a bunch of colorful columns here. Based on what I had selected, it's going to show me that passage, and it's actually going to start with verse 34. Let's kind of scroll up a little bit and look at the sections before and after. And so again, the pericopes seem to go 21 down through verse 38. There's 2 or 3 or 4 or 1, depending on your translation. And so these show the multiple translations. These are kind of my top translations, but really these are set by this drop-down box. You want to pick that and then put a check mark in these. Let's say I decide, hey, you know what? I want to include the NIV and get rid of the NIV 84 And I also want to get rid of the Holman Christian Standard, since I've already got the, well, it doesn't have the CSB in this list. I'm not sure why. But say I also want to do the Lexham English Bible, since I'm in Logos. And so you can pick those. I actually prefer to stick with what I had before, so I'm going to go back to that. But anyway, just put a check mark, and each time you put a check mark in one of these, then this pericope set from that translation is going to show up as one of these colored columns. Take it out. For example, we've got the HCSB all the way over here in kind of a light bluish aqua color. If I uncheck it, notice that it goes away. If I check it, then it comes back. So each of these columns is then split up into boxes, and the boxes show you the pericope in a visual way. So in the ESV, you get verses 18 through 20 is a pericope, verses 21 through 30 is another pericope, and then verses 31 through 35 is another pericope, and then 36 through 38. So as we look at this, what we're going to see here is going across, just visually, we can immediately see that most of these translations all agree that verses 31 through 35 is a single pericope. There's a couple of exceptions. I've got the NASB, and then the NLT, New Living Translation. It doesn't end in verse 35. Instead, it goes all the way down to 38, as does the 1984 New International Version. It goes from 31 all the way down to 38. And so it's kind of interesting that most of them agree. So that should be telling. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to pick the verses that they tell you to pick, that are in a single pericope. You might have good reason. But if almost all of these, and on occasion, I'll open these and every single one of them will agree. If that's the case, then you're probably pretty safe to bet that that's going to be your preaching text, or it needs to be. If it isn't, you at least need to say, I'm going to preach on verse 34 and 35 alone. You at least need to, somewhere in the sermon, put it in the context of verses 31 to 33. Now, I just preached this passage, and I actually put it in context of all of chapter 13 and into chapter 14. Now, putting it into context, that means that I, maybe a sentence or two talked about what came before, and then maybe, about a minute to 2 minutes of my sermon covered it, what came after it. I actually went with verses 31 through 35 in my sermon on John chapter 13. So that's a pretty good guide to say, hey, you're pretty safe in picking that. But again, you don't have to. Now, let's say I want to open up in my favorite translation to this pericope. I'm in the NRSV. I click it, but it still opens to the Christian Standard Bible. Why is it picking that instead of the NRSV or the NKJV when I clicked on that? And the reason is it's picking your number one translation. My number one translation is the CSB. So when I open up this and you look at my prioritization, notice I've got CSB first. What I've done is I've opened my library. I clicked on this link over here. It says prioritize. That's where you can rank your favorite translations. See, I've got CSB, ESV, NASB 95, NKJV, NIV 84, Lexham English Bible, NET. So, that's my ranking. That's why it always picks that. We've looked at the passage in its context in your favorite translation, or maybe 2 or 3 translations. Then we've opened up the passage analysis tool. All right, so that's kind of our second step. I'm going to go to the newer Sermon Starter Guide. That's new, I think, to Logos 7. I can't remember exactly when it came out. But in our previous video, we used it to find a topic, and I think we picked prayer as our topic. But the Sermon Starter Guide will not only search for topics, but it'll also search for a passage. All right, so we're going to pick 31 to 35 because that's where most of the pericopes agreed was a good foundational starting point for what to choose. When we open up the Sermon Starter Guide, you're going to see a bunch of different sections in here. For the purpose of picking what our text will be, what our pericope is, we're going to focus on just a few sections. We're going to focus on the sermons section and open that up. We're also going to look at the sermon outlines section. And then we're going to come down here to the outlines section. Now, if you have any books in your library that are based on, sermons, for example, I've got Charles Spurgeon's sermon. He's got two sermons that cover this passage. So we'll click that. Notice he's got one on John 13, 34, and 35. But it can tell you what other preachers have done to cover it. Augustine of Hippo, he went from 26 to 31. He did a 31 to 32. He did one on just 33, and then on 34 and 35. And so, it might be that we look at this and we say, okay, if Augustine of Hippo thinks 34 and 35 would be a good place, then maybe we should check that sermon out and see a little bit about how he dealt with that. Now, be careful doing this because you don't want other person's interpretation to cloud your interpretation. Again, we're just picking the passage, so it's really best to kind of focus on what did they cover. John Chrysostom, he did all of John 13 in a sermon, apparently. Now, we also look at the sermon outlines. These are, books that have collections of outlines in them. Croft M. Pence has a sermon. It covers 18 to 38. And then this John Lewis Mashek has one that covers just 34 and 35. And then we've got this one, covers all of John chapter 13. But our initial observation, hey, 34 and 35, someone else had that same thought. So then we're going to jump down here to outlines. And these come mostly from like commentaries and handbooks. So open up some of these commentaries and see what they cover as a section or as a pericope. By the time you've done this, I think you'll have a pretty good idea as to what you would like to preach. Again, I did it and I chose to go verses 31 through 35. And it was a sermon on glorifying God through our love. Remember that if you're covering a psalm, on occasion, it's okay to pick maybe just one verse or two verses in a psalm. But my opinion is to be a good expository sermon, you really need to cover that entire psalm. Now, on occasion, that's not appropriate. For example, Psalm 119, it's a very long psalm. But notice in Psalm 119, it's got sections, it's an acrostic with the Hebrew alphabet. And so if you were doing a series maybe through the Psalms and you'd pick one section of Psalm 119 and cover it, that might be appropriate to break up that psalm. But most of the time, I would say what you want to do, let's just throw out Psalm 100. That's 5 verses. Psalm 101 is a little bit longer, but still, you really probably want to cover the entire psalm in a single sermon. Even if you choose to just pick a section of a psalm, like this is a 28-verse psalm, that might be too long to cover in one sermon. If you're an expository preacher, you might want to go through it in a series, or you might want to just preach it, making sure to bring out the context of the rest of the psalm. It's really important, I think, psalms need to come together. Proverbs is another special case, parts of Proverbs are collected by subjects, and so it might be good to preach through a bunch of these. But it's perfectly appropriate if you say, this is one proverb. Hear my son, your father's instruction, and forsake not your mother's teaching, for they are a graceful garland for your head and pendants for your neck. All right, that's perfectly appropriate. Even though this pericope set from the ESV says verses 8 through 19 are a single pericope, this is a psalm, or a proverb rather. Okay, and so it makes sense for you to cover just that one proverb in your text. We're going to go back to the Gospels and look at Matthew. Matthew is narrative, mostly narrative. And so if you're covering, it's Christmas time and you're preaching through this, you're going to want to cover that single story. It's probably inappropriate to carve this up, into more than one sermon. You also don't want to try to cover too much. A good Sunday morning sermon on the birth of Christ, maybe just that section would be enough. Trying to go too far and go and cover chapter 2 with it as well, and maybe even to chapter 3, that's just too much. This is a single story in the overall story of the Gospels. And so in narrative, you really want to cover a story. Now, unfortunately, sometimes the story might be 3 chapters long, and that's a lot to cover, and you're going to do a lot more summarizing than you are verse by verse exposition through your sermon. But anyway, we've given you enough of the nuts and bolts of the basics of preaching through a section and picking that one section of the book using Logos Bible software tools. So after this, we're going to go into the observation and the inductive Bible study phase of preaching. And Logos has some great tools to help you do that. And so that'll be the step 3, the video number 3 in this sermon prep with Logos Bible Software. This has been Kevin Purcell. Thanks for watching.